is seen as the only possible viable system. There is very little discussion actually in any field, least of all economics, which is the most conservative field, and also political science, but even in sociology, there is very little discussion on possible alternatives to capitalism. The most that we envisage is, tinkering around with the system, modifying the system, but not radical changes, and not imagining other options to capitalism. So the Eurocentricity of thought and the Eurocentricity of the actual world are two Eurocentricities that mutually reinforce each other. Now, I think we have 2 minutes. No, I didn't ask how much time we have.
Take your time.
Okay.
Then we take a break and then we have a Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah, take your time.
So probably about an hour. Thank you. I want to talk about now reactions to Eurocentrism. Given that this is what we understand by Eurocentrism, I think this is quite an interesting topic. Throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there have been various reactions to Eurocentrism and various theoretical formulations of the problem. And most of this work happened since the 1950s. I'm not very familiar with the literature in Latin America. I'm more familiar with the literature in Asia, in the Middle East, in India, in Southeast Asia. But we find that in India, the debates about the idea of indigenizing social sciences, indigenizing anthropology and sociology already started in the 1960s. Even prior to that, in the 50s, there were criticisms of Eurocentric social science. Certainly by the 1960s, I had a very important essay by Professor Ralph Peary from Sri Lanka, The Plantation of Sociology in Asia, a critical piece. Anwar Abdul Malik in the 60s wrote an important essay on Orientalism. Very many people don't realize that he had written about Orientalism almost 20 years before, maybe about 15 years before Syed published Orientalism. And in the 70s, Abdul Latif Tibawi also wrote about Orientalism before Syed. But in the 60s, and more so in the 70s, you find a great deal of literature coming out of India, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, among sociologists, anthropologists, and historians, trying to understand the problem of Eurocentrism. Now, I said that there were several theoretical frameworks that were used to critique Eurocentrism. Now, I don't have an exhaustive list, but you have, of course, theorizing the problem in terms of Orientalism. I mentioned Anwar Abdul Malik and Abdul Latif Tibawi, and of course, Syed. You have Syed Alatas, happens to be my father, who spoke about the problem in terms of the captive mind, the problem of mental captivity. then you have a series of thinkers and activists largely associated with the Pan-Africanist movement whose work you could put under the category of colonial theory. Right? Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, Paulo Freire, Ivan Illich, and many others. Of course, Freire and Ivan Illich are not from the Pan-Africanist movement, but I was having in mind Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, and then their thinking had influenced also thinkers in the Caribbean, which then influenced African American thinkers. So that tradition is very, very important. And you also have another tradition of thinking that looks at the problem in terms of intellectual imperialism and academic dependency, which I've written about myself. So I'm not going to go into all these theories because that takes a lot more time. But I think it's very important, especially in a place like Taiwan, for you may perhaps taking a risk here. Perhaps you are more involved in more involved in an East Asian discussion and less knowledgeable about the debates happening in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Malaysia, and other parts of the world. That's why I think it's important that we realize that there has been a decades-old tradition of the critique of Eurocentrism. But I was talking about critiques of Eurocentrism that emerged after the World War, in the 50s and 60s. And this is true in the sense that a large body of literature began to emerge during that period, during the generation of my father, basically. I remember as a kid, in the 1970s, and my father was going to conferences, sometimes United Nations conferences, sometimes conferences organized in different universities across Asia, where he met with, I remember the names of scholars that he mentioned, and when I became a sociologist myself, I realized that these were all the scholars who were involved in these debates on the problem of Eurocentrism, on the problem of how to indigenize the social sciences and so on. So that generation, I think, was very important. And I mention this because sometimes people of my generation, and I also see it among students, my students, are sometimes reformulating the same old criticism of Eurocentrism when it is important to go beyond that. We can talk a little bit about that later. So you have the critique of Eurocentrism. More important is the prescriptions, as to what should be done. So, in other words, there's no point in simply critiquing Eurocentrism. What alternatives can we offer to Eurocentric knowledge? How do you do sociology in a non-Eurocentric manner, or in an anti-Eurocentric manner? How do you do anthropology in an anti-Eurocentric manner? How do you do historiography in a non-Eurocentric manner? How do you imagine the process of concept formation in a non-Eurocentric manner? These are the issues. So again, across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, there were prescriptions coming under different titles, different kinds of programs. I discuss in one of my previous works many of these approaches, but people talked about indigenization of anthropology or sociology. People talked about nationalization of the social sciences. I think this kind of debate took place in China, where there was, in the 70s, there was this idea of the need to align the social sciences with the national interests of the state. Others spoke about the need to globalize the social sciences because the social sciences were too West oriented. Yet others spoke about the need to sacralize the social sciences. So you have the movement to Islamize knowledge. You have the movement for Buddhist economics. In Taiwan, one of the prescriptions was the whole idea of Asia as method, right? Which I would be interested to discuss also if we have time. And one of the prescriptions, one which I am very much sympathetic with, is what is known as the decolonial option. Right? This is an option, this is an approach that was largely developed by Latin American scholars, people like Walter Mignolo. I'm sure you've, I think I'm not saying he was being here. Yeah. And Anibal Quijano, Ramon Bosco Bell, and I mentioned Boaventura de Sousa Santos and so on. And I'd like to say more about that again if I have time. Well, let me just say a few words about the decolonial option. I also have to say that in looking at all these alternatives to Eurocentric knowledge, some of these alternatives are actually fake. And I think that's an important topic, which I will end with. I'll end my presentation with that. Now, I think what is meant by the decolonial option, or what is meant by decolonizing knowledge, let me list it in terms of at least 5 traits. First of all, they demystify mainstream and dominant discourse, including those that present themselves as alternatives to coloniality. In other words, they interrogate the genuineness of discourses that present themselves as alternatives to Orientalism or Eurocentrism. So what this means is that, according to the decolonial perspective, opponents of the decolonial option, they emphasize that we continue to live in a colonial world. The world is not colonial politically anymore, because most countries almost every country in the world has been decolonized, right? Politically. But in terms of political economy, in terms of culture, in many respects, we still live in a colonial world, in the sense that, in many senses, but also in the sense that the colonial orientation during the colonial period was internalized by us, by people in the former colonies, and we continue to live under the yoke of these colonial orientation. So, for example, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, the view of the so-called native the self-understanding of the native is informed by colonial scholarship from the 19th century. So the way the Filipino thinks about himself is very much influenced by the way the Spaniards constructed the Filipino. The same thing goes for the Malays. And in Malaysia, the problem, ethnic division and discomfort between different ethnic groups, particularly between the Malays and the Chinese, is based on stereotypes, not exclusively, but partly based on stereotypes that one group has of the other, that were developed during the colonial period. And the way in which the international political economy is still controlled by Euro-America, the way the state system functions, the way international regimes function, still controlled by Euro-America, all of these point to the continuing coloniality of the world. Therefore, decolonization doesn't come about simply through political independence. It also has to come about through economic independence. But economic independence, for the decolonial people, economic independence means imagining alternatives to capitalism. Imagining alternatives to capitalism also means looking at alternative knowledge systems. And I'll come to that later. So, the decolonial, doing social science in the decolonial mode means demystifying mainstream and dominant discourses. Secondly, it means presenting theoretical and conceptual alternatives to Orientalist, Eurocentric social science. Thirdly, it takes local, non-Western knowledge traditions